Welcome, welcome, everybody. We're back with another episode of Wigs for Wigs. Now, if you tuned into our first episode, this being our second, you heard me talking with Bill Venezia about some of the qualities that make for a good president, the ability to have a core set of values that you hold true to, a credibility with the American public and with the American government and with the world, and other qualities that we felt were important. One of the things that came up in that discussion was prior service in the military, something that a majority of our presidents have in common. 13 of U.S. presidents out of our 46 people who have been president have been generals in the U.S. Army, so reaching the very top echelons of the Army before their service as president. And of the rest, many have served at lower levels of the military. Everybody from, well, the last one was George Bush Sr. We mentioned that in our last episode, fought in World War II. We haven't had a veteran since then. But before that, the vast majority of our presidents were veterans. And we'll talk maybe at some point about why perhaps we've gotten away from that. Because if you look at recent elections since George Bush, we've had John Kerry, who had significant military experience in Vietnam, lost the election. We had Bob Dole, who sadly just passed away a few weeks ago, great World War II hero. He had obviously great experience in the military, but he lost his election to Bill Clinton with no military experience. And we had John McCain, the war hero from Vietnam, who lost his election to Barack Obama. So we have gotten away from that experience in the military as a qualifier to become president. But today we're going to shift our focus to the military. I'm going to sit down with my history department colleague here at Hudson Catholic High School in Jersey City, Frank McGady, and we are going to sit down and talk about the qualities that make for a successful general in American history. We are going to limit this to America. We're not going to look at all of military history on this episode. You'll see that Frank is an expert at more recent 20th century military leadership. He, for instance, teaches a course on the World Wars here at Hudson Catholic, whereas my expertise, as I've mentioned in my initial intro in this podcast, is in early American history. So I'll be talking about the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the early conflicts in American history. So I hope you enjoy this discussion I have with my colleague Frank, Mr. McGady, about military leadership, what that has in common with political leadership, what maybe is different about it to be a general versus being a president, and also how the military leadership has changed over time with the advent of telecommunications and other aspects that have changed what it means to be a successful general. We'll get into all of that in this discussion. So sit back. We're going to break very quickly right now for an ad, and then I'll be back in about 30 seconds for my discussion with Frank McGady about military leadership. So stick around, everybody. We'll be right back. Let me tell you all about Anchor, because some things are just obvious, right? Like, we all know if you want the perfect cow to be the first one milked on an airplane in the year 1930, you turn to Elm Farm Ollie. No question about it. Well, if you want the perfect app to help you launch your own podcast, you turn to Anchor. Anchor has all the tools to help you easily record, edit, mix, and publish your podcast to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all of your other favorite podcast platforms. So again, you want to milk a cow on an airplane in 1930? You turn to Elm Farm Ollie. You want to create your own podcast? You turn to Anchor. All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Wigs for Wigs. I'm joined here with my history department colleague, Frank McGady, and today we're going to talk about qualities that make for great military leaders in U.S. history. I expect probably I'll focus a lot on early U.S. history. Frank is more of a 20th century expert than I am, so we might get some World War II in there, maybe World War I. I don't know how much. We'll talk about John Pershing, maybe. But that's our goal today, is discuss what makes a great military leader in U.S. history and maybe how that's changed over time. So I just want to give Frank a chance to introduce himself really quickly, and then we'll get into our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Joe. This is my first podcast, so I'm actually kind of looking forward to this. This should be kind of interesting. I've always been interested in history, military history, going back to when I was like 15 years old. So we're talking 1975. Oh my God, am I that old? So this is an interesting topic, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it.
All right. Yeah, so we'll just start off. Let's kind of just give who would be our top couple generals in U.S. military history, and then we can try to figure out maybe what's something that they have in common with each other. So I don't know. I know this is something we kind of talk about casually sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Top 5 lists, top 10 lists. So I'll kind of kick off and give you a moment to think about it since I'm springing this on you. So I'm going to focus on early American history. Eisenhower is in my top 5, but I'm not going to talk about Eisenhower right now. We talked about him with Mr. Venezia last episode as a president. So I'll say in the Revolutionary War, I don't think there was a superb American general. I think there were some that would be in the class of very good, people like Nathaniel Greene, Lafayette. I think Henry Knox, for what his job was an excellent chief of artillery. Okay. But I don't think there was a brilliant American general
you got to throw
in the
Benedict
Revolutionary
Arnold
War.
in there too.
Benedict Arnold's the other one that I would have included, actually. While he was an American general, he was an excellent combat leader and good at other things too, with his invasion of Canada.
And Saratoga.
My list is going to be Civil War heavy. I'm a Civil War expert. I would put Ulysses S. Grant up there.
Absolutely.
Grant, I think, has been shortchanged historically, and there's various reasons for that. We'll get into what I think he was good in a moment. I would have... I'll give Robert E. Lee it, although I think he has serious flaws also as a general that we can get into. We're going to do another episode where we talk about the failures of generals, the shortcomings. And then I have maybe somebody who's not as well known to all of you listening out there, which is Winfield Scott. I would personally put Winfield Scott at the very top echelon of American military leaders in all of our history.
I would agree with that. I would put him in my top 5 also.
Yeah, because he had everything. He was a combat leader in the War of 1812. Then he was the supreme commander in the Mexican War, coming up with the grand strategy, and also in the Civil War in the early stages came up with the strategy.
Yes.
And gave Lincoln a crash course on what it meant to be a military leader also before he retired. After that, it gets tough for me because then we're getting into maybe lower level leaders and people like that. So I want to give you a chance to maybe who are some of the people other than Scott and Grant, who you agreed with right there, in military history in America, who you would put in your top 5?
I'd also have to put in George Washington. Not as a great tactician. He constantly kept losing battles. He kept getting flanked all the times in battles, Brandywine Creek.
Falling for the same thing over and over again.
He didn't have the military background. Remember, he was just a planter, a farmer, and then suddenly he, just had, he was with Braddock in the French and Indian War. So he learned how to get defeated by the Native Americans, but at least be smart enough about how to pull back.
Just because you used the term, so for our listeners, what is the difference between tactics and strategy? You said he's maybe not a great tactician.
Yeah, tactician is the way you plan a battle, where you put your troops, how you plan on fighting. Well, strategy is your overall where you're moving troops, what towns or cities you want to take.
More of the big picture.
Right, yeah, big
strategy.
picture versus small picture.
Okay, so we have Washington. I have my issues with George Washington, but I do too. But I agree in the big picture he was very good.
Without Washington, we probably wouldn't have won the war.
Right, I agree with that.
His biggest thing was keeping the army together.
Yes.
He was a charismatic leader that the men, to me, one of my top feelings for a leader is the men would follow him anywhere.
Yeah.
And anytime you have a leader where the men will follow you anywhere, you know they have to be a good leader because that's one of the big qualities I personally think of a good military leader is how you lead the men and they're willing to follow you. And some of the soldiers would have followed Washington into hell if he had told them.
Mm-hmm.
So
let me just ask you in connection with that, and then we can get to more of your list. Do you think that's changed over time because generals in more recent wars are not expected to be on the front line? Is there a difference in maybe what we mean by they're willing to follow you anywhere. Like, we're men willing to follow Eisenhower anywhere. Because I think we would agree that Eisenhower is a great general at what his responsibility was, but he wasn't personally leading men onto the beach in Normandy.
No.
So how do we maybe make sense of that in transitioning to
I think
the
you see
modern
it more
world?
now in the lower levels, combat levels. The colonels and lower ranking generals who are like you see them in Iraq and Afghanistan. And soldiers will come back. Yes, that was a great leader. Everyone thought that Petraeus was a great
was
leader.
an excellent leader.
And
Odierno was another one in the modern war.
I think that most of from what I've read from the Pentagon or whoever chooses who the leaders are over there has done an outstanding job in Iran and Afghanistan, Iraq. I'm sorry, and Afghanistan.
Unless there's something we don't know about.
Don't even say that. Iraq and Afghanistan, because they seem to have picked a lot of really good leaders there. But I think it is a little bit changed. I don't think Schwarzkopf, when he was in the first war in Iraq, certainly he was in the back doing things. I think he was very successful in what he did, but I don't think he had the same loyalty.
I think he did inspire the men in his own way. It wasn't. It just wasn't that he was out there facing the bullets.
No.
Whereas if you're talking about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, I mean that's just expected of a general that you are
especially
exposing
some of the
yourself
lower
to
ranking
danger.
generals who actually were in front of the troops. And if you look at Pickett's charge, watching all those colonels getting picked off, and lower ranked generals getting hit because they were expected to be up front.
Yeah, so Washington, who else would you have in your...
Well, I also agree with Nathaniel Greene, and I hate to say Benedict Arnold.
I know. Benedict Arnold was a very complicated one.
He was complicated, but
he was the George Patton of the Revolutionary War, the best combat leader America
had. Without a doubt. I mean, look at the Battle of Saratoga, where his command was taken away from him by Gates, who was so insecure. And then he went out to decide, I'm going to fight myself, and the men just followed him.
Yeah.
Because, though Washington liked Arnold.
He did.
Yes. But most of the other men, because he had one of those abrasive personalities that kind of turned people off.
Although some of those lower level leaders who we would consider some of the better ones, Dan Morgan, who was a great leader of riflemen, Henry Dearborn, who went on to be a Secretary of War, was a low-ranking officer under Arnold. They were very loyal to Benedict Arnold because I think they recognized that bravery and battlefield genius that he had.
And he did. It's just a tragic thing for him that he did what he did because he would have been he would have had statues. He would have had towns, mountains, rivers named after him, counties.
Right. Supposedly, when he was wounded at Saratoga, somebody asked him, "Where were you hit?" And he said, "In the leg. I wish it was in my heart."
Yeah.
And if he was killed right there, he would be the great hero of the Revolutionary War.
He would have been, without a doubt.
Look, where our school is located, we're both teachers at the same school. On one side of our school is Mercer Street, named for General Hugh Mercer, who died in the Revolutionary War. On the other side of our school is Montgomery Street, named for General Richard Montgomery, who was killed in the Revolutionary War, who's one of my great what-ifs of American military history. But there would probably be an Arnold Street here. This part of Jersey City has a lot of different streets named after generals. Even Henry Halleck has a street named after him in this part.
And Gates has one.
And Gates has one.
Oh.
There's nothing for Arnold, though. And
go downtown, there's Lafayette, there's
Lafayette,
Washington, there's Green Street.
Arnold, Arnold, we forget because he turned traitor. That's what we know about him, if anything, today, was a great military leader.
Yeah, and it's a shame. His ego and his wife turned him against it.
But, how about in World War II? Let's bring it a little bit forward, because I know we're both not Douglas MacArthur fans, and we can talk about that another time.
I'm an Omar Bradley fan.
You're an Omar Bradley fan. So what do you think made Bradley such a good leader?
Because I thought he was someone who's willing. To me, he's like the Zachary Taylor of the World War II. The man who's willing to sit down and have dinner or in a foxhole eating out of his helmet with his other soldiers. And, Taylor was the same way in the Mexican War. He just, he'd go and visit the troops and it wasn't like I'm going to be back at headquarters. And Omar Bradley was someone who realized, there's that great line in the movie Patton. I don't know if it was actually true, but there was the character, Carl Malden playing him,
Yeah.
and he said, "That's the difference between you and me." When he said to Bradley,
Right.
to Patton, "You do this because you
you
love it. I do it because
it's a job.
It's a job that has to get done."
Yeah.
And that's the
I think
difference.
that was, it's
That's
good. I'm glad you brought up that line. And actually, that's something that's held in common by others that we've talked about. Washington and Valley Forge did not stay in a headquarters building. He slept out in a tent with his soldiers to show that he was with them. So maybe that's one. Maybe that's the connection there. That even Petraeus, we were talking about in recent wars, he's out there with the men. He's not back. Eventually he became Central Command commander, and he's far away. But when he was actually in charge in Iraq, he's out there in the streets with his men. So that personal connection, Zachary Taylor, you mentioned. So maybe that's it. Although Winfield Scott did not have that.
No, old fuss and feathers.
To bring
No,
back
he did
one of
not.
the others that we mentioned.
But he was a great leader.
Was a great leader, but did not have that personal touch with the soldiers.
No.
Are there any others from World War II who stand out?
I also, because we focus on military leaders, the Army, but I'll throw out Chester Nimitz.
Let's bring in the Navy. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Chester Nimitz of the Navy was another one of my favorites. He was, and I thought that in the movie Midway that Woody Harrelson did a great job portraying him as just not...
How's he versus Henry Fonda as... As I want that fourth carrier.
Yeah. I thought he did a great job. He showed Nimitz as being not as confident, which, of course, in the early years of the war, who would be confident?
What reason
especially
do we
after
have to be
Pearl Harbor.
confident?
But he did show him as being unassuming, and he was like the polar opposite of, let's say, a Douglas MacArthur. Who was just a walking ego. Nimitz had no ego.
Yeah.
He was, again, someone who was just interested in getting the job done. I think Bull Halsey was also out, if you take away the one...
I think some of those great naval leaders had that in common with Omar Bradley, Dwight Eisenhower, people who were able to put aside their egos, enough at least.
Right. So we don't talk about them enough, the naval leaders. But
well, I'll bring in David Farragut then in the Civil War.
Another one,
I think if you're making a Mount Rushmore of the U.S. Navy, it's got to be Nimitz, Farragut. We'll put on John Paul Jones, but I think he's overrated personally. But,
yes, I would agree on that one. But
and Bull Halsey probably would be the fourth on that Mount Rushmore.
Right. These
people who led from the front. I don't believe that David Farragut actually strapped himself to his ship and sailed into the mines, damned the torpedoes. He said it probably, maybe.
Probably, yeah.
But I don't think he's strapped in as a suicide mission if he goes down, the USS Hartford.
And then there was, what's his name up in World War I, Manila Bay.
Who was the other great naval leaders of World
I don't know if he was really a great naval leader.
But effective.
He was effective because he got the job done. And I'm talking about...
I know who you're talking about. I'm drawing a blank.
Admiral Dewey. Who's from Vermont, believe it or not. He's from the right in Montpelier, Vermont.
Admiral Dewey, who was in the Spanish-American War, wiped out the Spanish fleet.
Which, of course, wasn't hard to do. The Spanish fleet was so old and falling apart. A good, strong wind could have wiped them out. But he did do it the right way. He minimized
U.S. losses.
Yeah, to one sailor who didn't even he died from heat stroke. Actually,
look, then he captured the city of Manila with a fake battle, which is its own interesting story.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, he didn't leave. He stayed. But no, he was a very competent, and he probably would have done very well in a difficult situation.
Yeah, we don't really get a chance to know that about Dewey. Is the problem?
I think he's like Pershing. There's another one who I thought was a good general. He understood what he had to do, though. The thing that's always funny, because they always talk about Pershing wanting to be the Americans to be independent, and we don't want to be defensive. The Americans are not going to fight in trenches. We're going to be aggressive and attack, and it was very successful. But of course, that was 1918.
Right.
That wouldn't have been successful in 1915.
Marshal Foch saw what that, or Marshal Haig, I should say, not Foch, saw what that was all about early in the war.
Unfortunately, with Marshal
the British
Haig,
general.
Of course, Haig never learned from his mistakes. He just kept doing it. You think that
fool me once.
You think the old the Einstein quote.
Insanity is doing the same thing
over and over again, and that was Haig.
You'll have different results.
Right, exactly, and it didn't happen. But I think that's one of the advantages. By the time Pershing was there, the German army was pretty much on its last leg. As I tell my students, that you had the young soldiers, the American soldiers, were all your age, 18, 19, 20, some 17, maybe 16-year-olds.
Harry Truman was,
right, and then you're fighting against
his age to join.
Right, well, yeah. then the German generals were the German soldiers were all in their 30s and 40s because the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were dead.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit easier, and the Germans pretty much were defeated by then. So I think if Pershing would have had a different attitude had he decided, would have been a different result if he decided to be aggressive in 1915 and the Americans suffered a Battle of the Somme-like defeat. Yeah. It would have been a lot different. I think Pershing's reputation would have taken a major hit. So I think Pershing was a good general, but he was also lucky in the timing.
That's one other topic I wanted to discuss, and let's finish our discussion with this, which is along those same lines. Do you think it works for or against a general the way we remember them, who they were facing? For example, Robert E. Lee. We considered him a great general. We're not getting into the politics of it right now, but he's a great general.
Okay.
But he was beating George McClellan, John Pope, Ambrose Burnside. Grant, his early victories were against John Floyd, who ran away at Fort Donelson. John Pemberton. Their victories were not against top-tier generals. Right. Does that work against them, or should we still give them credit that they're coming up with these strategies that are winning these battles? I mean, should it not hurt their reputation that their schedule is what it is?
I think the classic example of that would be Chancellorsville. Lee pulled off what people see as the most incredible maneuver, but it could have turned into a major disaster if just one thing had gone against it. He was. It wasn't,
and even Joe Hooker later realized that. Joe Hooker was not a terrible general.
No,
he was an okay one.
I thought that Hooker was a very good general.
But he later said Joe Hooker just lost confidence in Joe Hooker.
Well, and I think a lot of that had to do with Burnside and Fredericksburg. I think some of these generals, Fredericksburg affected the psyche, as you know, Joe, more than anyone, affected the psyche of a lot of military leaders. I mean, it was such a disastrous defeat. Everyone was so paranoid that they didn't want this to happen again. And I think Hooker saw that and was afraid that we might face
it was going to be.
But he had him. He had Lee. Lee got caught.
And Chancellorsville has that same psyche effect on the Army, because when Grant comes east a year later, he says in the Wilderness to his generals, some of you seem to think that Robert E. Lee is going to pull off a double somersault and catapult to both ranks and the rear at the same time.
Yeah.
And, well, I'm not... This is not original to me. I've heard Brooke Simpson, a historian, say this many times, that seems to be a pretty accurate description of what happened at Chancellorsville.
Yeah. But had, he split
that these generals who experienced that was still in their mind over a year later, whereas Grant had not had that experience facing Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, Lee was lucky that a lot of the what-ifs didn't come to be. What if Sedgwick had decided to press the heights at Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg with a very reduced force? What if Hooker decided to attack the Confederates where he had them near the Chancellorsville crossroads there, and press them while Jackson was off in the woods somewhere so far out? What if Jackson came out of the woods and Howard's Corps was ready, regrouped real fast and stopped them? And there's so many what ifs that could have happened.
Right, we praise somebody like Robert E. Lee, again, leaving the politics out, for his aggressiveness against these subpar generals that he wins battles because of. But there's very little difference really in philosophy between the battles he won, say Chancellorsville, the risks he took there, versus the risks he took at, say, at Gettysburg. Yeah. And yet we condemn his bad decision-making at Gettysburg because it doesn't work. But we praise it in Chancellorsville, because it worked. So
I think the problem in Chancellorsville, he had no other choice. It was either that or retreat, because he was in an impossible position. In an impossible position, he had to do something. Yeah. But it was also a position he got himself into by holding on to Marie's Heights and not watching what was going on. And Hooker pulled off. And, the thing is, we criticize Hooker for the battle. But his planning, pulling out most of the arm, getting around without being seen.
He did surprise Robert E. Lee. He got around him. But then he just froze. The first time he ran into Confederate troops, he froze.
If he had kept pressing, the war may have ended right then and there. I mean, because
at that same moment, Grant is making progress towards Vicksburg.
Right.
He's got Vicksburg under siege almost at that point. Right. We're around the time of Champion Hill at that point, moving towards Vicksburg. If he had, got around Lee and really hit him hard, that might have been it.
It might have been. It could have been it, because Lee would have had no other choice but then to retreat. And of course, Grant was the one, as you know, Joe, that pressed him. That no other general would press, In fact, I always liked the line that Lee knew as soon as he saw Grant was in charge, he knew he was in big trouble.
Yeah. Well, and again, we criticize Grant historically, and I think it's unfair for his aggressiveness in fighting Robert E. Lee, but he was accomplishing what he was meant to accomplish.
Yes.
Why are we okay with Robert E. Lee being aggressive as a general and losing a higher percentage of his men than any other general in American history? And yet, historically, people have criticized Ulysses S. Grant for being aggressive and finishing off Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
Grant
was always good because he understood what it took to win the war. I mean, something the British generals never understood in the American Revolution. They figured we'll just capture city after city and Americans will
William
surrender.
Howe was an awesome battlefield general. Beat George Washington every time.
Every time.
But never had that killer instinct to finish him off. That's what hurts his reputation.
Yeah, but there was more to Howe, though. I think
there was.
Howe didn't finish off the Americans because he never really wanted to finish it.
Right.
He never saw us as...
He liked Americans.
He liked the Americans because what they did to his brother in the French and Indian War. They treated his
General
brother
Howe, William Howe, who was the British general at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, early on, who captured New York City and Philadelphia. His brother, one of his brothers was the commander of the British Navy in America, Black Dick Howe. But the other brother of the Howe brothers had died in the French and Indian War and was given a big military burial by the American colonists. He was treated as a hero, and the Howe brothers never forgot that.
Yeah, no, they never
Americans.
did. They kept, every time they won a battle, Howe would never follow up with it because he was hoping that the Americans would why he was saying, you guys want to give up? Oh, they don't?
Good, thank
All
God.
right, well, I guess we have to keep going. And then after he says, you know what, I don't want to fight anymore, and just went home. But he gets criticized a lot, but... He really wasn't the person the British should have put there because he was very good.
And he was a Whig. He was opposed to the war.
Opposed to the war. It was actually a bad choice by whoever was making those decisions. But that's another story for another day.
Story for another time. So we've had this discussion. We've talked about some of the successful generals. We could pin down one thing that at least most of them had in common. What would it be? Is it that they were one with their men?
Yes, I
maybe
think
Winfield Scott was the only one we talked about who that was not the case for.
I think with anything, with sports coaches, with bosses at work, if you inspire loyalty, you inspire leadership where they're willing to go above and beyond. I've seen coaches where players will just go through the walls, go through the boards for them. I've worked for bosses that I would kill for them if they told me to do it because they inspire such leadership, and that's the ones I think. And you say, well, is it being a good strategist or tactician? Well, I think that's part of it because men are not going to be loyal and so gung-ho to someone who just what's his name? Our favorite Civil War punching bag.
Braxton Bragg.
Oh, I was thinking of him.
George McClellan.
They're not going to be loyal to McClellan because if he just loses battles, why would
he's
we want
looking
to
to
be
throw
loyal?
people under the bus, too.
Right. But I think you get these loyal guys that
like an Eisenhower had that letter that he was ready to deliver to the American people, the speech,
and
if
Patton,
D-Day failed.
People still...
He was going to take the responsibility.
I'm not as overly a fan of Patton as a lot of people was because I think he was more about himself and getting glory. I mean, yes, he did accomplish what he had accomplished, but... did more Americans die because of that? Because he wanted to be first. He had to beat Montgomery to Messina. So did more Americans die so that he could stroke his ego?
I think the way you've put it is good. And I'll say, just to add to that and finish up here, that it's part of being part of the team. Like, I think that's something that Grant was very good at, working with the Navy, for example, building relationships with other leaders.
Yeah.
I think that's something that Eisenhower, Bradley worked well with, was working as part of the team. Scott was not one with the people, but he did inspire people in his own way, which was that he did not hand out praise easily. But if you got it from him, you knew that
you deserved it.
You deserved it, and people were willing to put their heads through a brick wall to get that praise from Winfield Scott because it was hard to come by. He wasn't quick to throw you under the bus unless you were a political opponent, and he had enough of those.
Yeah.
But that was a whole other element. But the people who were good soldiers and were loyal to him and were doing their job, you were willing to do what it takes to get that praise from him and please him. So maybe that's it. That it's about having the good strategy and the good tactics, but also being
inspiring loyalty
and being one with the men. That they feel they're a part of something.
Right.
So, do you have any last thoughts here? As
No,
as
I
wrap
think
up?
we did a really good job on this. This is my first podcast. I really enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun.
We are going to do a future episode where we talk about the generals who were not good, and that might be a more fun one, even because it's more fun to criticize people than to praise them.
Yeah.
But
okay,
excellent. So I hope you've enjoyed this little chat. As always, listeners, please. Please reach out to us with any questions, any thoughts. What do you think are the most important qualities for a general? Who do you think are the best military leaders in history? And maybe we'll share your thoughts on a future episode. So take care, everybody, and I hope to see you back next week for another episode of Wigs for Wigs.